This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by Atom Audio, Isotope, Native Instruments, and Grace Design. You're hearing my voice right now through the Grace Design M201 Mark II mic preamp into the Empirical Labs EL8X distressor mixed through Isotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, and Nectar, all on Atom Audio monitors. Please check out our awesome sponsors using the links in the show notes. It's a great way to help support this show, and we really appreciate it. Now, get ready to rock.
The important thing behind it is the intention. You're either helping tell a story for an artist, or you're helping sculpt a score around a film, but it's always about that story. And it might be somebody else's story, or it might be your own story. But having the confidence to know that actually what you're creating, because those intentions are good, is kind of, by definition, is sounding like a record.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Atom Audio celebrates 25 years of designing industry-leading monitors in Berlin by unveiling the Arctic White A4V and A7V monitors, available for a limited time. With the XART ribbon tweeter design, customizable speaker voicings, and SonarWorks integration for room correction, these monitors deliver professional-grade sound perfect for Grammy-winning producers and home studios. Make your studio cooler than cool with the Arctic White A4V and A7V, available for a limited time with the standard extended 5-year warranty at atomaudio.com. Are you struggling to make your mixes sound professional? If your tracks feel weak, distant, or lack punch and clarity, I've got the perfect solution. My free course, Mixmaster Bundle. This course will teach you how to achieve pro-level mixes from your home studio using free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. But these techniques will work for you in any DAW, whether you use Logic, Cubase, PreSonus Studio One, Reaper, or another. If you're ready to make your best record ever, go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started now for free. Find the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Howdy, Rockstars. It's your host, Lid Shaw. Welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Matt Robertson, a British-born, Canadian-based, 3 times Grammy-nominated composer, producer, and musical director. Matt has worked with Bjork, Anohni, Arca, the Cinematic Orchestra, and Ellie Goulding as a musical director and orchestrator arranger. He's released 4 albums under his own name to date, balancing ambient sound design along warm, organic techno and ripples of delicate electronics. His albums, Forecast, In Echelon and Entology, have been described as symphonic electronica and leftfield techno that's cinematic in scale by Mixmag, and magnificent wild electronic sound by the line of Best Fit, and Nils Fram's modern classical meets Jon Hopkins' grainy techno in MOJO. Growing up listening to a healthy mixture of Jean-Michel, Jarre, and Jimmy Smith. That's a cool combo. Matt graduated from the University of Surrey before working at recording studios in London, learning how to fix and later build some of his own synths, working with a collection of vintage, modern, and DIY synths, and combining electronic music production with classical composition and cinematic soundscapes. Artists, producers, and film composers alike seek out his enveloping and distinct sound. His work with Anoushka Shankar awarded him 2 Grammy nominations, and he recently scored the films The New Corporation, The Unfortunately Necessary Sequel, and Navalny. Thank you so much to Damian Taylor for making our introduction. It's a pleasure to be here meeting Matt. Please welcome Matt Robertson to Recording Studio Rockstars. Matt, are you ready to rock, my friend?
I am totally ready to rock.
So, that might be an unfair question as I dove into your discography and just felt incredibly relaxed and peaceful. You make music that, how do you want to say that, man? Do you feel like your music rocks at times and at other times helps you just chill out?
That's a really good question. I mean, I feel like my default go-to is that I'm quite a stressed person. And so when I'm making stuff that I would put under like my artist, put in my artist folder, I tend to default to things that try and make me feel less stressed. Having said that, I'm a bit like double-sided in that respect, because I really like stuff that is really full on as well, Yeah. And I kind of seldom sit in the middle of those two things. So it's either like really drony ambient or just really crazy hardcore noisescapes.
Okay. All right. Dig it. Where does the stress come from? Is it the British, the Canadian, or the fact that you're dealing with technology?
It's my inherent Britishness, I think.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, I think like just life in 2024 is pretty stressful.
There's plenty to be stressed about if you want to stress out. That's true.
Yeah.
Although, if we were being eaten by saber-toothed tigers, that could be stressful too. I mean, in the big scheme of the arc of human history, we're probably not in such a bad place, but you wouldn't think that when you look at the news, Yes, indeed.
So I think like the stuff that I try and create, for me is like an escape from that.
Yeah.
Rather than a reflection on that. I think sometimes artists maybe go one way or the other. It's either about what's going on or it's the opposite of what's going on,
Well, it's interesting when you talk about that, because there's many times where I've thought, it'd be compelling to make music that's about what's going on and stuff like that. But then sometimes I think about, I don't know, a band like Rage Against the Machine or something, and I would think like, it's not like every single song they did rages, but it kind of does, So so would it be would it be frustrating to feel like you always had to make some big bold statement every time you made music? I mean, sometimes it's nice to just make music because music is great to listen to and it feels good.
Yeah, totally.
So, Rockstars, we have a discography of Matt's in the playlist. You can just click down or scroll down and then click on that if you want to listen to some of the work that we're talking about. A lot of great stuff and very, 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 very ambient, especially the discography that you sent. I don't know how much of the stuff you feel that's in there represents that kind of stress side of writing music sometimes. But but it's really cool to listen to your music and think about, questions about like that come to my mind, like, how do you make ambient music? How do you get into this? How do you do that? I come from a world of chasing a pop song. I'm a rock band with two guitars, bass, and drums, and somebody singing and a verse and a chorus. Yeah. So we'll get to all that stuff, but give us kind of a brief overview and arc, of your story getting interested in music. And like right now you're joining us from a beautiful looking studio setting. And I see a lot of wood. It just makes me think of organ consoles,
Yeah, I've got this old Hammond organ behind me that unfortunately doesn't get turned on.
Not all of us have the Hammond
days,
right in our control room. That's what's great about it.
Fantastic. Yeah. So I think my kind of arc started when I was probably like 7 or 8 years old, and my mum wanted to learn to play the piano, and she bought a little Casio home keyboard, like a Ranger keyboard, and I think I basically saw it, and then mum was like, you know what, I think Matt should play this instead of me. So I think her piano playing dreams kind of went out the window, but it sort of started off my kind of lifelong love with making noises with instruments.
Was it a particularly special Casio?
It was an MT64, which I don't know if it was particularly special. I haven't looked it up in a long while, but it was one of these little keyboards where you could like hold down a left-hand note and it would play a little rhythm section.
Oh yeah.
And then you could play some tunes over the top kind of thing. And I just thought it was amazing,
Not like weighted keys, though, right?
No, tiny little, tiny little mini keys. I just started making some music on that, and I did start having some piano lessons at the same time, or around that time. And I was really fortunate that my piano teacher, when I was a kid, was really into what was then new technology. So I remember, this is a few years later now, but I remember like when the Korg M1 came out, my piano teacher had a Korg M1, and this just like totally blew my mind away. It was like, what? Like the sounds that came out of this thing in the
80s or
mid 80s, right? I guess. I don't know
it's
exactly
funny.
what year it was.
One of my mentors, Robin Eaton, he talked about being so impressed with the Korg M1 and selling like some vintage guitar so that he could get that or something. And then later he's like, what was I thinking? I guess it depends on where you're going. There might be those out there that would much prefer to have a Korg M1 than a vintage guitar. I don't know.
And I think I was only young at the time, so I don't really have a kind of context to put it in, apart from the fact that for me it was like nothing I'd seen or heard before.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people in the mid 80s that was a similar thing. Just these new instruments came out that let you do stuff you couldn't do before, and there was obviously like a section of musicians, as there are today. There are people that want their vintage Telecasters, and there are people that want Eurorack
vintage
modules,
Korg M1s.
No, totally.
Well, I mean, in the mid 80s too. I mean, this is the era of Thomas Dolby coming at us out of the radio speakers, and all these great, here we are talking about ambient music, but keyboards at the heart of pop music at that time too.
Totally, yeah. I think I just kind of started on that path, and was playing a bit of, like, I guess you'd call it classical piano at the same time. But what I was really interested in was, I guess you'd call it sound design. I was really fascinated by when I got some different like keyboard synthesizers a bit later on, where you could actually like edit your own sounds and create your own patches. That's what I just found really interesting and exciting, And I think I've always been really interested in this concept, which I guess is at the root of it, kind of one of the kind of cruxes of ambient music, which is that it's music with the minimum number of notes.
Yeah.
And
maximum
I think
number of reflections.
Maximum reverb, minimum notes. But within that, and within the sound design, and within the way that different harmonics and stuff might filter in and out, you get all these like little kind of sub melodies, I guess, which are completely different from like if you sit down at a piano or play a guitar and you're picking out a tune. But like within 3-minute drone that on the first listen might just sound like a 3-minute drone that isn't changing, there's all these tiny little micro things that are going on. And that was what kind of always interested me about like creating sounds on synthesizers. And then that kind of went through to when I started making my own music and I was building on those kind of building blocks of the more droney side of melody.
Yeah. Was there a particular artist or anything that early on caught your attention as an ambient artist that sort of introduced you to the concept of drones, which of course drones have been around as long as, ancient classical music,
Yeah, totally. I think it was quite late on in my life that I actually even knew that such a thing as ambient music existed. But even when I was growing up, the kind of music that I gravitated towards was, like my mum and dad played a lot of Pink Floyd records, and the sort of dronier side of Floyd and the dronier side of Jean-Michel Jarre, which is, all kind of filmic cinematic synth textures.
I love that Jimmy Smith was in there, and there's your Hammond organ behind you too.
Right, and Jimmy Smith had this incredible piece that I always loved called what I want to say it was called The Sermon, but I'm going to have to check that. But it's like this. It's kind of like this sort of 10-11 minute long improvisation, but it's almost kind of like when I imagine like contemporary pipe organ music, which is something that I don't know a great deal about, but it kind of felt like that. It definitely wasn't like a jazz improvisation. It was him like playing the organ in this really like harmonically complicated way, but in a very sort of fluid way. You know, it was all these like, the way the chords all overlapped sort of sounded sort of orchestral and I guess you'd say cinematic now to me. So like even within these things that I'm listening to that are kind of more like rock and jazz, it was the kind of textural ambient side of that I was sort of interested in.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of stuff that struck me from that. I mean, even listening to like Pat Metheny records and stuff back then, there was a lot of droning sounds going on in Pat Metheny Travels, stuff like that. I mean, I know I'm kind of leaning towards guitars there, but who is it? Lyle Mays that he would always play with, right, on keys.
Right, yeah.
And it's cool stuff. And you know, when I talk about how ambient music has been around for ages, you know, in the 90s is when I heard about things like Tuvan throat singing.
Yeah.
And these acoustic droning kind of ambient quality musical creations.
Yeah. I think it's been a part of you know, all genres forever, you know, and it's another record that I listened to a huge amount when I was growing up because my parents played it a lot was the Peter Frampton Comes Alive record. And there's the, you know, in that middle section of Do You Feel Like We Do, and it goes down to like the talk box and the Fender Rhodes. There's a lot of textures in that are really fascinating, I think, more like ambient textures, even though it's, you know, it's a rock record, right? But it was always those parts of those records that really fascinated me. You know? And also, like, you're just listening to like Irish and Scottish folk music, where quite often, I can't remember what it is, but you'd have like a drone of a fifth down at the bottom, but it would be the top note of the fifth that was the bottom note, if that makes any sense. So you were so it was like a inverted fifth. So you're always kind of droning on like the fourth of the key.
Interesting.
Kind of thing. And so you got this like texture that went all the way through it, and then you'd get this like beautiful folk melody on the top. But the way you got that slight kind of inharmonic stuff with, you know what key you're in, but this weird fourth root that's droning right the way through is kind of throwing where you're placing the harmonies and stuff. But all of that happens like really slowly over a long period of time. And yeah, I think, those were the things that still do really like fascinate me about musical structure and how all those elements go together.
So yeah, of course, another inspiration for drone, being British, of course, is, you're not too far away from, all the pipes instruments. If you just head a little north, right, you've got the Scottish bagpipes and you've got the Irish.
And bagpipes is a very special kind of drone.
Yeah, I love that stuff. I've always loved that stuff.
Yeah,
are there and then of course stringed instruments like fiddle, fiddle parts and stuff like that. Very, very drawing. Yeah. But anyway, we don't have to turn this into too much of a history of musical drones. But the let's bring it forward a little bit. Talk about your experiences in studios and stuff like that, and then getting into becoming an artist yourself and putting out the music that you've been doing.
Yeah, so I did a music degree that was kind of like half like actual theory and classical music training and half music technology, and part of that course was that there was like an industrial placement year in that degree. And so all the people that I was on the course with went to work for various industry places. Quite a few people were in recording studios. A few people were in like, tech support or manufacturing or audio research. And I was super lucky, and I ended up working at Strongroom Studios in London in about 1997, 98, I think. And I think at that time, the only recording studios that I'd been in were kind of little local project studios that I'd recorded a few things with, like, as a teenager and at school. And, we're probably recording to like a Fostex 8-track 1/4-inch or something like that. And, had a great time doing that. But going to Strongroom and sitting, which is like a proper facility with 4 or 5 rooms. And at that time it was 24 track 2-inch and Pro Tools. And so the move to Pro Tools was sort of just about starting.
Yeah.
I think
it was still thought of as an addendum to the tape machine, right?
Exactly. So the session. So I started working at this recording studio, and I was in the tech support department. So basically, I was responsible with some other people there for setting up all the sessions, lining up the tape machines, making sure the Pro Tools rigs worked, zeroing the desk, all that kind of fun stuff. And then also, if the pan pot on a channel of the SSL stopped working, it's like, okay, can we swap out this channel and make this work? And so I started that position really knowing very little about any of that stuff. I hadn't even experienced a studio facility of that scale. And suddenly I was like in there and had this sort of position of responsibility where I was meant to know stuff and be able to fix stuff.
Did they teach you that kind of stuff in school? Did you learn some of the
there was some some of that stuff, but it was very theoretical, and the reality of doing that when somebody is paying for studio time is really different.
Yeah, that's true.
And I was super lucky, and there were a couple of people that were working at that studio who were my mentors, really, who were really patient with me and taught me a vast amount of stuff, both about, actually, okay, well, how do you make the pan pot work again? But also, how do you walk into a session where people are stressed and paying a lot of money and make it seem like everything's still cool?
That's how you learned how to make chill ambient music. You're just like, as you walk in the door of the control.
Maybe that's it. I think you've got it there.
Carrying tea, right? You guys would have been carrying tea into the session.
Exactly. So I was doing that for a while, and through working there, I met Damien Taylor, who was pro tooling there at the time.
Yeah.
I met this guy Neil McClellan, who was producing the Prodigy records at the time, and through meeting Damien and Neil, when I left that position, they asked me to come and do some other projects with them, and I worked this out a few years ago. I was doing kind of this flow diagram of where all these different projects over the years came from, and pretty much every project that I've had over the last 25 years has in some way come from a friend of 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 meeting Damien Taylor and Neil McClellan at Strongham, which is really, I think is really fascinating. And in one sense, it's terrifying because you're kind of like, wow, what if I hadn't have met those people? Would I have had a career, or And on the other hand, I think it's just really inspiring because it's like you can basically meet one person in your life and have a career that stems from that somehow. I think
that's good to talk about. I mean, rock stars, remember that it's the people that you meet that really do matter a lot. But also, I think to your point, Matt, is like people you meet early on are going to create that network effect, particularly if you're dedicated to your craft and you're going to stay on the path,
Yeah, totally. And I was 21, I guess, when I was working there, and learning about that working environment and the massive fun and creativity of it, but also the real stress and pressure of it.
Yeah,
was so eye-opening at 21. And see, now I'm thinking about it, there were so many occurrences in my time at Strongham that were so kind of pivotal to how my career developed and how I interacted with people.
Yeah.
And I there's one little story that just springs to mind that I'll tell you. So
bring it on.
So there was this, I'm ashamed that I can't remember the engineer's name, and maybe it will come to me. But there was an engineer working in Studio One at Strongham, and there was a problem with one of the servo motors that controlled how the rewind speed worked on one of the MTR 90s, which is a 24-track tape machine. And it had been a little bit fidgety, and sometimes you'd go into rewind and it wouldn't get up to speed, or sometimes it would go too fast, but then you'd hit stop a few times and it'd be fine. Anyway, this one time it completely freaked out, and the engineer had rewound the tape, and it had basically just gone as fast as it could possibly go, and
scary.
not being able to stop at the end. And so at some point, the physics of it meant that the whole, however many 1,000 feet of 2-inch tape was just spooling off the machine onto the control room floor. And it was like this little, soundproof machine room. So it's only about, I don't know, 10 foot by 8 foot or something. And the tape is literally kind of like filling up the space, as it's
Were you
spooling
in
off.
the room with the machine?
I wasn't in the room. I got the call after it had happened to come and look through the window of the room.
Oh God!
Because they'd said I think maybe like the day before, they're like, yeah, the rewind's a bit funny on this machine, and I couldn't find anything wrong with it at the time. And then he kind of pointed through the window and was like, yeah, that's my tape.
Oh my God! And then you open the door and you just you do like a swan dive into the pile of tape. And you're just like, bye.
I should have done. And I was actually way more like terrified and anxious than he was. And, it's basically like his session, it's his tape, and now it's all over the floor. And he was sort of then saying to me, because I was like visibly like, oh my God, what are we going to do? This is a disaster. Like, how are we going to solve this problem? And he was just like, you know what? All we can do is spool it back onto the machine, see where the dropouts happen, and work out whether we've still got a song or not,
Yeah.
And the way that he dealt with that situation, this is like a paying client. I don't know if the artist was there at the time or not, but, a paying client under a lot of pressure, paying a lot of money, and our machine has basically just like canned his whole project.
Yeah.
And he's just like, you know what? Let's just wind it back on the machine and see what we've got. And there were so many little events like that were just like, oh yeah, that was a fantastic way to deal with that situation. And I wouldn't have dealt with that situation in that way, But I count myself really lucky that I've been able to work in a few of these sort of studio environments where you learn so many of these things. And that really, I think, particularly when I was much younger, when those things happen enough, you're like, oh yeah, that's a really good way to walk through the world and deal with these situations. Because he could have just, he could have totally lost his shit with me, and it would have been
and there are people
entirely
that did.
my fault. And
there are people that did for sure. But I agree with you. I heard so many stories about, somebody would describe some great engineer here in Nashville, and they would say that they had this ability to just, when shit hit the fan in the studio, they had an ability to just make everybody laugh about a story instead, or something.
Right.
Just keep everybody really relaxed. Hey, rock stars. Yeah, you. I've got a secret to tell you. Want to know how I get a consistent sound mixing over 1,000 hours of recording studio rock stars? My secret is using iZotope, RX, Ozone, Neutron, Voice Enhancement Assistant, and Nectar to make sure every episode of this podcast sounds great. Right now, you are hearing RX Breath Control, D-Click, D-Clip, DS, Deplosive, Voice Denoise, Ozone Multiband Compression, Neutron EQ, VEA, and Limiting, all from iZotope. Use the secret code ROCK10 to get 10% off, or pick up the new Trash Light along with many of the other free cool plugins over at iZotope.com. The other part of, you talking about the experiences in the studio that reminds me of that, all that too, is even if it was, obviously working in an old school studio, you had an opportunity to learn a lot about the tech of the machinery and making records and all that stuff. And that's all great, but tech comes and goes too. And the tech is different today than it was back then. But but one of the things that I think you really do get to learn is when you immerse yourself in an environment where everybody's taking the record making very seriously too. It sort of imprints a seriousness to the art and what you're creating that can carry with you that I think is really valuable. Did you feel like that was something that you got when you were there?
Yeah. And I've thought about this kind of thing a lot, because I struggle sometimes with like balancing taking the process and the art seriously while not taking yourself too seriously, and making those two things balance out somehow. And I've definitely struggled. I still struggle with, I will take I'll take an idea or a concept so seriously sometimes and be so focused on it that you then lose out some of these other like fun areas around the outside that can also help your creativity, and I think maybe that in a way, and I this is off the top of my head, it might not make sense when it comes out, but maybe like the in the slightly older school way of a recording studio where you had the role of a producer and the role of an engineer and the role of an artist, and they all had kind of pretty fixed lanes, and in that environment, I think each of the people in those lanes can be really like serious. I'm not even sure if serious is the right word, but sort of focused and serious on their lane. And I feel like now, because those roles very much overlap with each other, it's kind of more difficult to really focus on, let's say, the engineering if you're actually kind of also producing the track and coming up with the bass line, or I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm kind of making this up, but I think the ability to really be serious about your art, I think, is kind of made easier when you're in an environment like a studio facility, and surrounded by other people that are also doing that. And it's something that I struggle with a bit in my home studio, which is, and we call them home studios now, but it's like it's a studio that happens to be in your home. But my family are upstairs, and I can go and have dinner with my daughter and meet her when she comes home from school, which is all amazing stuff, clearly. But it's a really different way that your brain focuses on the process of your day's work than it would be if you're in a studio facility and you rock up at, 9 o'clock in the morning and you leave at 10 o'clock at night, and that's all you're doing in that period of time.
Yeah, you guys went home as early as 10 o'clock at night?
Yeah, maybe I'm underestimating that a little bit.
No, I agree with you. And the first, when you described, producing and not being engineer enough, my experience might have been initially the other way around, was engineering, and then being introduced to some opportunities to sit back as a producer when somebody else engineered, and going, and having this realization, is like, wow, I hear things differently. I have a different experience with the music and the song. I think about it all differently. There really is a lot to collaboration and to assigning different roles of what you're doing. Even if you switch roles while you're working, just knowing that you can focus on a particular aspect of it. And then when I think about what you said about the home studio environment too, I wonder if it gives us a little bit more of the perspective, like we're a little better in touch with the perspective of just being a consumer of the music we're making. Because sometimes I'm just more often in the car running an errand and listening to the rough mixes than I ever was when I was actually working in the studio every single hour of the day.
Yeah, I wonder. That's interesting. I don't know.
It's easier to do so now too, because the mix is on your phone, playing through the car stereo as soon as you drive somewhere if you want it to.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I'm for me, I feel like the difference is the amount of focus that I have over a long period of time. By which I mean, if I'm working in my home studio, like, I don't think it's rare that I'll get like a 90-minute period where something else doesn't happen,
Yeah.
And maybe that's a really good thing, but it's definitely a really different thing than being sort of, locked away in a studio environment, a commercial studio environment where all of your focus is on that. I just think
that's
how
it was back then, right? It's like the only thing that could really interrupt you was if that office phone landline happened to ring or somebody walked in. Otherwise, you really were just immersed in it.
Yeah, or if your tape machine spooled your project onto the floor. I think they're just really different things. I'm not sure one's necessarily better than the other, but they're definitely different. I don't know if one makes better art at the end of it or not.
So when you were in that studio setting, and it's Strong Room Studios, is that right?
Yeah.
So when you were in that setting and working with Damien and those guys and making those records, so Prodigy, I don't I'll just say I probably don't know their music well enough to make all the right comments, but I think, as I recall, Prodigy is a little more EDM leaning than ambient.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah, right.
It's definitely the opposite of ambient.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. I just didn't want to presume that I didn't know about, such and such a record. Yeah. But the, so you're dealing with a lot of synths, you're dealing with MIDI back then, and all sorts of, hybrid creation of synthesis music. Talk more about that. And then again, like sort of pivoting into the ambient stuff, and let's talk about the way you create now too, because I really want to dive into that more. Because again, as I preface this, I say, like, I come from a pop music background where it's like, I'm in Nashville too. So I spent a lot of time trying to understand, like, what the hell is a song,
Yeah, totally.
And why is it 3.5 minutes long or whatever?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think when I was growing up and listening to music, although I was, as we were saying earlier, I was really interested in this like idea of soundscape creation, but at the same time, everyone's listening to songs, right? It was all about the song. And I think when I started working at Strongroom and started to understand a little bit more about how people were making electronic music, it just really shifted my perception of like what a song is and how people create it. So like at that time, I was messing around on synthesizers and stuff, and I was, making some of my own tunes and stuff, but I wouldn't say that I was like creating art at that point, Right. I was just kind of messing around. I think like when I was at school, there was, I think they had like an Amiga computer, which had some form of like notator or whatever it was on it that I sort of messed around with a bit. I was like, oh,
what's
you can
an
move.
Amiga? Was that like a Commodore or something like that? Or
it was, I think it was his, I think it was the,
the Commodore is going back to the 80s.
Yeah, so there was like an Atari ST that was like the classic MIDI thing. Yeah. I feel like there was like a competitor to it called an Amiga, but
it probably was. Yeah.
I might be making that up now. But
I was sort of already on a Mac by the late 90s, and and then of course by the time 2000 hits, we're all just sort of on G3s and
Totally.
I don't think.
So I think
the G4 was out yet.
I think when I started at Strongroom, the G3 had just came out. So people were coming in with like the Power Mac 9600 with like a Uniter 8 MIDI interface or a MOJO MIDI interface
for your
SCSI cards. Oh my god, yeah. Oh wow,
an 8 gig hard drive sounded like the biggest thing in the world.
I'm glad those days are over. So we'd set up a studio session that might have like a Power Mac 9600 running. Probably, I remember people using Logic, and I remember people using Logic for MIDI then, and then sending MIDI out to like a couple of Akai samplers to trigger maybe like samples or drum sounds, and then running MIDI into, I don't know, like a Juno 60 or a couple of other synths, and maybe having like a 909 drum machine running MIDI clock, chasing the MIDI clock from it. So you'd have the sequencer would be running on the computer, but everything was, we called it running live in those days. It was like you weren't necessarily printing all these things to a multi-track tape machine. Sometimes you'd just have all of these different sources like drum machine, sampler, synthesizers, all coming up a mixing board. But then your mix would be made by like pressing play on the MIDI sequencer. And then quite often, I think people just print that straight to a like half-inch master tape. And then, so sometimes it was, and we'd call that running live, I think. And then sometimes people would also like print those individual things to like a 2-inch multitrack so that you could actually mix from the multitrack and not have to have all your gear plugged in and triggering all the time in order to make it work. But within that, because you've got your song is basically, your MIDI arrangement, it means that you've got total flexibility and fluidity in how those elements build and what order they come in and the sounds that you're making. And so that was kind of my introduction to having this this kind of related but also slightly like two-part process of, okay, here's MIDI information that is sending out notes, and that's going to these electronic devices that are making sounds, and we're controlling both of those things in real time, and that's how we make a song.
Right.
And to me,
so it's like, if I'm hearing you correctly, in some situations you would commit all those synth sounds to multi-track and then mix from there, and in others, why commit it when you can just, it's like having plugins on your tracks that you can adjust at the last minute. Why commit it if you can, and plus there's probably a purity of sound if it's just coming out of the synth going through the analog console and it's mixed straight down to 2-track, probably have a cleaner tone, right?
Exactly. And it's funny, there's been a couple of projects that I've worked on as a musical director where we wanted to get like a multi-track from a song that was made in the 90s. And then we've looked it up and it was like, oh, the multi-track never existed.
Wow.
Everything was just running live straight to a master tape. And then in some cases, I've been able to like recreate it by, sometimes like the MIDI session would still exist, but the instruments in between the two wouldn't. So I was like, okay, well, I know I've got this part of it and it was probably plugged into a Juno or an ARP or something. Yeah. So let's plug that into there and try and recreate that sound and recreate it that way. But it was definitely just a different way of doing things. And having that flexibility there, I found really inspirational because it was just a really different way of doing things than writing a song at a piano or a guitar and then going into a studio to track it with a band. It was just a really different version of that.
Well, what's cool about that is I can imagine that it, like, as you said, it opened up a flexibility where sometimes you don't really know how the song's coming together until you get to the mix. Mm-hmm. And so having that ability to make some more decisions musically and arrangement wise at the mix probably felt really powerful in terms of the creation process.
And I think that, that can obviously be a blessing and a curse because, part of my remit for working in the studio is to commit to decisions at every stage along the way. Yeah. And in a way that was sort of the opposite of that. But also it was creating a really different genre of music. And in a way, like a lot of that electronic music genre was sort of created and defined by the processes that we used to make it, So that was kind of my grounding in that area. And it was funny because I think at that time, although I was really interested in synths and soundscapes and stuff, I was still playing a lot of piano. And I used to be really interested in the idea that actually a lot of this electronic music you could make with electronic instruments, but actually get musicians to play them. And my friend Neil McClellan, who I was, who I met through Strongroom, he always used to laugh at me because he was like, "Oh, Matt, you don't think that you can make music with MIDI?" And I was like, "Yeah, well, maybe we should have some more musicians involved." Well, and he just thought that was the funniest thing because as far as he was concerned, it was like, no, just sequences and MIDI and synths. That's great. That's all there is to it. And then and it's kind of funny now because now I'm almost like the opposite of that, which is that pretty much everything I do is with MIDI. And I regrettably, in many ways, it's been a long time since I've recorded a musician in a room with a microphone.
Well, now some of the records, like Extemporate, It's Been Okay. That one's got this sort of wind organ sound with a drone.
Yeah.
And it made me I was like scratching my head. I'm like, what instrument is that? And then it has this like beautiful acoustic sort of stereo space to it. And it sounds very acoustic to me. So
I'm really glad you said that because that was definitely what I was going for.
Wow. So that's you finding a way to create stuff with MIDI and using synths, but really mimic physical and acoustic instruments to give you that impression.
Yeah, so that particular, it's really interesting that you picked that one out. So that particular sound is a sample that I made of an organ that was made by this guy called Bjorkvin, who is an Icelandic organ maker. And I met him through a project that I was doing with Björk. And this was probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now. And I was doing this project with Björk and I was MDing her live show. And for this particular tour, she wanted to take 2 registers of pipe organ pipes on tour with her. So she and they were going to be controlled. They were going to be played via MIDI, but they were like, real pipe organ pipes with a blower and air going through them. And so this amazing organ maker called Björk Tommensen, I believe, who is based in Reykjavik and makes incredible pipe organs for all over the world. He made these 2 registers of pipes for her. And at some point, I thought it would be a good idea to record it. So I sampled each register of each pipe and did a nice long recording of it, and then looped it into a sample. But it's kind of sampled with all the fabulous slight pitch imperfections that you get when like the air starts going through the pipe and then stops going through the pipe, and they're never quite, they're never quite in tune. So I had this sample that had been lying around for probably 10, 11 years, and had never really used it. And then I had this track I was working on, and I was wanting to create this like sense of like something building in an acoustic space. And I thought, I've got this pipe organ sample that I made 10 years ago. And so that's what I used. And I was really like happy that I found a use for it after all this time.
And then you were like, damn, where are those old emu discs?
Yeah, exactly.
We're gonna have to load it back up, right?
And that was actually recorded into EXS24 into Logic Pro. So I had like an old EXS24 patch for it. And there was this amazing thing. There was this amazing bit of software called Keymap Pro that doesn't exist anymore. But it was this really, really clever bit of software where you could basically just drop a bunch of audio into it, and it would go, oh, that's a B flat, that's a F sharp, and map it all and loop it all and do all the stuff that usually takes forever when you're trying to do your own sampler instruments, and just kind of churn out this instrument for you in it did like, you could export it to external samplers or software samplers. It did the whole lot. And then at some point, I think like 3 or 4 years ago, the guy, I think, either stopped developing it or it got bought out by somebody else. I can't quite remember. But yeah, it was an amazing piece of software. And that's what I used to make that organ sample.
No matter what style of music you create, Native Instruments provides you all the instruments you need, from drums, loops, and beats to vintage and modern synthesizers, realistic strings, guitar amps, and futuristic synth pads. I really enjoy recording real bands in my studio, but then adding amazing overdubs from Contact, Massive X, Super 8, Battery, Guitar Rig, or Hybrid keys. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off or get complete start for free today with a bundle of 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples at nativeinstruments.com. And now it's like, if you're now, all the software manufacturers, if they don't already have that included in, by default, right? They're probably getting beat up in all the
they've all got their own versions of it, right? But I one of the things that I'm maybe slightly too fascinated with is, with all these iterations of software, stuff gets better and stuff gets worse, and certain amounts of character get brought in or taken out. And there was this piece of software called Recycle that, and so you'd recycle
Rex files.
Totally, and so you'd make Rex files to drop into an Akai sampler. And there was something really unique about how Recycle did its splitting, and it would take like the last bit of tail of a drum hit or something, and then just like reverse and loop crossfade the end of the tail, which gave you this really specific sound that was really different to time stretching the whole thing, which is what most like splitting and time stretching things in DAWs now do. And it had this really unique sound, I thought. And now it's been like improved on, quote unquote. But sometimes it doesn't happen very often now, but like, occasionally I'll be working on this thing and I'm like, oh man, I really wish I could just drop that into Recycle and get this particular type of sound that you had in Recycle. And the sampler stuff's like that as well, right? Like this thing called Keymap Pro had a very specific way of finding where the loops were and crossfading them in a way that was just fantastic. And even though most other things do that now, on paper, yeah, you can do that, but it just doesn't sound very good, or a lot of them don't sound very good. So it's weird. Yeah, like you say, everything does everything now, but I'm not sure it necessarily does it better.
Yeah. Well, it's, there's so many aspects of that. So, we don't have to go down too far down this road, but, for the rock band in the studio, along came Slate Trigger, and all of a sudden the thing that just took you forever to try and set up was sort of instantaneous if you wanted it to be.
Yeah.
And it's pretty amazing to see those things, but there's a lot of fun in learning the hard way on some of these things too. Did I just say there's fun in the hard way? I don't know, but but it was cool to see how this stuff really went together, to know how it was all made.
And I think it's really interesting to try and work out what that actually means for the creative process and what you're trying to make. And it's a similar thing to what we were saying about like when you're making a record in a home studio versus a more sort of traditional studio environment. There are so many of these things. I think
the home studio environment can be just as serious for making a record as long as you're surrounded by people who are being very serious about it too.
Oh yeah, totally. I'm not suggesting that it's not. I just think it's a really different thing.
Yeah.
So like with the Slate Trigger, I remember, how many hours have I spent doing tab to transient, paste a next track, copy a snare drum set in Pro. I've done all that, and now you just don't need to do that.
Yeah.
And hopefully that means that people make better stuff because they're not spending the time doing that stuff.
You make different decisions, that's for sure. And you may not know the intricacies of the track you just recorded in the same way that you would when you're zoomed in and looking at every single hit,
Totally. Yeah.
So there are different perspectives you get from these different ways of working. Hey, I wanted to ask you something. You mentioned doing MD work. What is MD work?
So MD work, musical direction. So I do quite a lot of work as an MD for various live bands and artists. And what that really means is that you're kind of responsible for shaping how their live show plays out, both in terms of like, what music, what notes are the people in the band actually playing, but also oftentimes it's like, what tech do you need to actually make that happen?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I'm working with Ellie Goulding in the UK at the moment. I've been MDing for her for the last, I think, 3 years now. So we've worked on like 2 album projects together. Well, I'm not working on the album, but I'm working on bringing that album into a live show environment. And I feel I don't know if this is the case, but I feel like if you're like a band, like a Radiohead or a U2. You probably don't need an MD because you're a band and the band exists and you go out and play your record. But if you're an artist that has made a record in a studio that doesn't like have a band, either because, it's just not traditional band instruments or because, you're not a Radiohead or a U2, then when you come to the point where you need to go and play that out live, it's like, okay, how do we make our studio record into a live experience? And so my involvement in that sometimes is coming on like right at the beginning of that process where the personnel don't exist yet. And it's like, okay, so what lineup do we need? What musicians are we going to use? What tech do we use? Are we going to audition a bunch of musicians? Once we got those musicians, how much rehearsal time are we going to spend with them? And then build it like that. Sometimes I come on much later in the day where the musicians already exist and a lot of the sort of protocols of how stuff is going to go together already exist, but they want some sort of specific changes or different arrangements done, or different ways to interact with their tech to allow them to do shows in a particular way. So
all of a sudden the extended outro makes a lot more sense. The super long solo fits now, right?
Totally. So I feel like for me, it's a really good, it ticks a lot of boxes for the things that I'm super interested in, because I'm really into tech. I'm really into how tech plays a part in live music and particularly like electronic music performance. And I'm really into like creating like the arc of a live show so that, you get this, 2-hour experience of live music that hopefully is, really exciting and transformative for people that come to see it. So there's a lot of tech involved in terms of, that might be, okay, well, we've got a bunch of guitar sounds that we need to make. How are we going to actually make those guitar sounds sound like the record? And are we actually going to use amps, or are we going to do it all with modelers and have a silent stage? And then drum parts is like a huge part of it, because in so much, or at least, a lot of the sort of modern music that I'm involved with, the idea of a real acoustic drum set just doesn't really happen that often anymore for projects that I'm involved in. And yet, when you're doing a live show, that's what a lot of people really want to come and see and hear and respond to. You kind of want to see somebody hitting drums because it looks great and it sounds loud and it's exciting. So quite often we end up with this like hybrid approach of having a real drum kit, but it's got triggers on it that are playing samples that were used on the record, and then you get like this hybrid approach of the two things. That's kind of that's what the MD stuff is.
So that reminds me of a show I saw. I went and saw Beck perform here in Nashville, and the songs were off his more recent album. They were so much more. Well, I guess he's always just had this mashup of samples, and it's very a lot of constructed music in the studio, but it really had this live band look and feel to it. But it was. It was just, but it sounded like it was constructed in the studio. And I thought that was a really cool thing to see on stage. So I imagine that's probably, they probably had an MD helping to put that together. Or maybe Beck was the MD. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. And I find that a really fascinating part of where we're at right now with music, which is that so much of it is constructed in this kind of, I was going to say virtual reality, but it's not really virtual reality. That will be in, 3 or 4 years' time.
Right.
But, we have these studio environments where we're creating this amazing stuff. And obviously, there are genres of music where it is very much about tracking the band in the room. And that's awesome. And I love that. That's just not really the part of the industry that I'm personally involved in. So a lot of the music that I'm involved in is kind of constructed without a band all playing at the same time. And then when you come to do that live, it's like, okay, what elements still make sense to perform this so it kind of looks and feels like a band, and what elements does it just not feel like to do that? And one like really simple example is if you've got like a pop song that's got like a 16th note arpeggio, not even arpeggiated, but like a 16th note kind of gated synth bass thing going right the way through it. You just can't really play that.
Right.
And if you did play it, it wouldn't feel like this sort of machine 16th thing that is giving the song that feel. They're just different things. So if you can't have a person play that, what do you do with it? Do you actually like have it literally playing off a backing track, which then has all these other knock-on effects that then you don't really have much freedom around that? There can be freedom around that, but you've got to jump through some hoops to do it. Or do you have somebody that is like hitting a trigger pad that is playing 1 bar's worth of 16th notes that are in time with each other, but then the next bar might have a tiny shift to it so that you can still play like a drum kit along to it? There's like a handful of different ways to solve that problem, and they're all as good and as bad as each other, and they all lead to very different like performance disciplines. And that's what I'm sort of really fascinated in.
So when you mention the hitting a trigger, the question that pops into my mind is, would a sound like that play instantaneously at that arpeggiated tempo, or would it be like an Ableton Live where it waits for the 1 count again and then plays like you're triggering just a new I forget what is Ableton
like a clip in Ableton,
like
and
it would
quantize it to the bar. Like I think if I was doing it with triggers, I would do it instantaneously, because if you have it quantized to a grid, it means that there is a grid somewhere.
Yeah.
And if there's a grid somewhere, you might as well be playing it off a backing track, I think.
Yeah. That's interesting to hear you say that, because I remember watching bands go through that, where it is a live band, but they're trying to figure out how to incorporate backing tracks on the stage, and then they play to a click. And then as a musician, as a producer myself, I'm really attentive to like, does this feel great or not? And I would see bands play with backing tracks to a grid, and I just was like, they're playing everything just right, but it just doesn't feel exciting. And then I'd watch the same band do some stuff off the click, some songs like that. I'm like, that just felt so much more exciting. So it's interesting to hear you say that even in this world that is coming from synths and stuff like that, you still make those decisions to let it have that live element to it that makes it feel performed.
Yeah, I mean, like my kind of remit is that I would like things to be as live as they could possibly be, and sometimes that's just not possible, or it doesn't serve the song that you're doing at that time. But I also think a huge part of that is that there are musicians that can play to a click track and make it sound exciting.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very particular skill. Mm-hmm. Just as in the same way, I think, I work in the film music industry a lot, and I do a lot of like orchestral recording sessions where 99.9% of it is to a click track. And there are orchestral musicians that can play to a click and make it sound great. And there are orchestral musicians that really struggle with that. Mainly, usually because they come from a background that isn't so click-based, like they're playing in like actual, more traditional orchestras where you're following a conductor. And they're just really different skills. They're different abilities. And I think a lot of it is this, it's a very similar story with drummers playing to click tracks. If you've got a drummer in a band who really has that ability to play to a click track, but know that, perhaps, in this fill into the second chorus, I'm actually going to push ahead of the click a little bit because I know I can make up that time a little bit by bar 4. And it gives it this like ebb and flow of excitement. But that's a really particular skill. And I think it's like unfair in some ways and I'm guilty of this myself, that, sometimes you've got a band and you're like, okay, we're playing to this click track. And you're like, oh, it's just not really working how it should. And it's not necessarily because you're playing to a click track. It's just maybe you don't have the right personnel for the scenario that you've set up for yourself,
Yeah.
So I think all of those things have to like balance each other up. But I still have this sort of slightly romantic view that, when I go and see a live show, I want to see a band playing and I want it to speed up and slow down. But at the same time, I really love electronic music that doesn't do that. So I'm always trying to like come up with ways to make those two worlds meet in interesting ways.
Atom Audio is celebrating 25 years of researching, developing, and manufacturing industry-leading monitoring solutions in Berlin. To mark this milestone, our friends at Atom Audio are unveiling a special limited edition series of monitors that will look stunning in your studio and sound as awesome as your music. Introducing the Arctic White A4V and A7V series. Available for a limited time to pro and home studio owners like yourself, the clean, glossy white finish exudes a luxurious feel and will stand out in any studio or home audio system. Featuring the XART accelerated ribbon tweeter design and customizable speaker voicings, the Arctic White A4V and A7V retain the full specifications of the original design. Plus, with SonarWorks integration for automated room correction, you can fine-tune your monitors to your control room's acoustics. Atom Audio's commitment to delivering professional-grade, high-fidelity sound to studios worldwide has made these monitors a perfect fit for Grammy-winning producers in both pro and home studios for a quarter of a century. Now you can bring that beautiful high-fidelity sound to your own productions and make your studio look as cool as your music sounds. Don't miss out on the limited edition Arctic White A4V and A7V monitors, available for a short time with the standard extended 5-year warranty at atomaudio.com. I am really impressed with iZotope Ozone. I've been mastering many of my records recently, and Ozone makes it so easy to get a fantastic sound. The built-in mastering assistant helps by analyzing the mix and suggesting all the settings needed for a professionally mastered result based on the genre and EQ curve of your choice. You can even reference a specific song if you want, using simple yet sophisticated modules like clarity, impact, low-end focus, stabilizer, imager, exciter, and spectral shaping, along with powerful dynamic EQ, compression, and limiting. You just adjust the settings to your taste and it sounds incredible. And the magic of mastery balance means you can manipulate the level of the vocal, bass, and drums even at the mastering stage. Amazing. My bandmates are pretty demanding, but now when I send off the masters for approval, they absolutely love the way our records sound thanks to iZotope. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off Ozone or other tools like RX and Voice Enhancement Assistant, or grab any of the cool free plugins like the new Trash Lite at iZotope.com. Howdy, Rockstars. We're back now for the jam session, aka the second half of the show. My guest today is Matt Robertson, joining us from his studio in Canada?
Salt Spring Island, Canada.
That's what I thought. All right, cool. You ready to jam?
I'm totally ready to jam.
What's the name of your studio?
It's a good question. It doesn't really have one, but when I really have to write it down, I slightly unceremoniously call it 175 Music, because when I've had my very first, when I started like my first company, it was called 175 Limited, and so basically whenever I'm short of a name, it's like, oh, 175, that's fine.
There you go.
And that's my email address, and that's everything.
Hopefully it's not your password. Don't say anything.
It's not, just not the password, no.
Okay, cool. So I got one question about the MD stuff, and then I want to bring us back into the studio because I really want to talk about how you're making these great sounding records. So if this is a fair question, the MD process, we talked all about taking this, brick by brick construction of a song from the record and figuring out how to rebuild that house on a stage so that it sounds like a version of the music. And also I had some sort of funny joke questions like, does that mean you finally get to delete that stupid overdub that, so-and-so wanted to do on the record? Where you're like, there's no way in hell we're doing that on the stage. But the real question is, or did you get to add the one where you're like, I always wanted to sing background on this? But
you know what's actually the slightly even funnier version of that is sometimes you work on a project where somebody else has already deleted that crazy overdub, but the artist is convinced that it's still there.
Oh,
but
that's
because
funny.
But because you never heard it in the first place, they're like, yeah, but what about that backing vocal part? I'm like, there isn't a backing vocal part there.
But they remember it from the session.
They remember it being there.
So the reverse question I wanted to ask you is, what are some things that you learned from creating this MD environment on the stage? You talked about how do you create all these guitar sounds, so which means you probably got into modeling amps on the one hand, but then you probably also got into complex MIDI switching rigs with, drawers of guitar pedals and stuff like that. What about that creation of a sound on stage did you then take back to the studio that became part of your writing and recording process?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. My experience of translating that from one to the other is more in the keyboards department.
Okay.
So similar to what you're saying, you're kind of rebuilding this house on stage, and you've got all these synth sounds, and there's a bunch of different ways to create those. And I guess there are people that like love their vintage Gibsons and Fenders, right? And no new guitar will do. And for the longest time, I was like that with synthesizers. I like, no, it's got to be like a late 70s mini Moog or, insert vintage synth here.
Right.
And then the more work I started doing for live shows, you just can't take that stuff with you on the road. It's just no fun for anyone. And so similar to what we were talking about earlier about sampling this organ, I started doing some like really deep sampling of various instruments in order to make them work for live shows. Sometimes that was literally like sampling the old Mini Moog, or sometimes it was taking a snippet of a sound that was actually on the record and then trying to like stretch that out or recreate it to make your new instrument. I set up a lot of shows where all of those keyboard sounds were coming from instances of Contact running inside main stage, running on a laptop. And for various reasons, in the last few shows that I've done, I've been moving away from the laptop and more into the hardware equivalent of that. And this, what like sitting behind me at the moment, is a Nord Wave 2. And the Nord Wave 2 is a Nord keyboard that lets you run samples inside it. And in the big scheme of like software samplers, it's really basic. But what it does really well and efficiently. And so I ended up with this kind of library of all sorts of different things, some which I created myself, some which are sampled from other people's records, that all live in this piece of hardware that then goes out on the road. Well, you know, I then like save the files from it, send them to the people that are actually playing the shows on the road, and then they upload them onto their Nord Wave 2 and they have their sound set. But what it's meant is that in the studio, I have this really easily accessible library of things that exists in a piece of hardware. And for me, that's been kind of a game changer. And I can't quite work out like why it is, because in a sense, there's no difference of having all these sounds baked into a piece of hardware that I can select with by turning a pot round or pressing a access button. Like, why is that different from having to open Contact on your computer and go to the drop-down menu and select that sound? And yet somehow, because of the way my brain works, when I'm actually trying to create stuff, I'd way rather have it on the hardware than in the software. I don't think I don't think one sounds better than the other, but in terms of accessibility to it and being able to really quickly audition sounds, having it in this piece of hardware is just so much better. And I would imagine it's a similar thing for... I'm going down a bit of a guitar gear rabbit hole at the moment because I'm working on a more guitar-based project, and as you were just saying, I'm sort of looking again into this thing of, you know, do we do it all with a, you know, Kemper or a Helix or a Axe Effects, or do we have a massive MIDI-controlled pedal board? And they've both got their pros and cons, but I feel like in the studio, at least, I would rather have a big pedal board in front of me and be able to hit physical things and try stuff out than be looking at my computer screen with a drop-down menu. Yeah. And I still don't quite know why that is. Like, it doesn't make logical sense to me that one would be so much better than the other, but somehow it is. I
agree with you. There's a whole lot of, you know, playing an actual guitar in your hands feels better than... I don't know. I don't even know if this exists, but playing a MIDI guitar that's trying to recreate guitar sounds, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, for me, it's, you mentioned Contact and Native Instruments. And if there's more you want to talk about that stuff, I'd love to hear it, because I bet you know the shit out of that stuff. But like, for example, I got the Contact Complete keyboard. Yeah. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, now I can audition some sounds and make some adjustments to it. But even any kind of controller controlling what's inside the computer is always just a wee bit slower than a dedicated keyboard, how quickly it can just go from sound to sound. So I know the Nord is particularly favored for live stage stuff. I just did a record in here with an artist who just got his new one, and we were whipping up sounds. It was, you know, you can flip through sound so quickly, which is really great. Totally. So I can see how that would be a good experience.
And I think it's also a really good way to curate your own library. There's something about having to put the stuff in the hardware. Somehow, I don't know, maybe it makes you like be a bit more intentional about what you're actually saving. It's like, do I want to keep this sound? Is this something I'm going to use again? Yeah, I'm going to put it in the hardware. Yeah. Whereas I think the software kind of encourages you to just keep everything, and then it makes your own like self-curation way more difficult.
in your example, you talked about creating the sound in something like Contact, and then you can, once you've created it there, you can import it into the hardware keyboard. Is that correct?
I don't necessarily create it in Contact, but I might, for example, make like a keyboard patch to kind of replicate a sound that's on a record, and then I would sample that sound into the Nord. Basically, is kind of how it works. But what I've found by doing that is, for example, just last week I was working. I was working on a collaboration track with this guy who's a really amazing piano player called Corey Alstad, who's also based in Canada. Coincidentally, he's actually not a million miles away from me. And so he'd recorded this piano track, and we were going to do this collaboration track and make it a bit more kind of ambient soundscapey sounding. And I think and for the first time in ages, I literally was using my computer like a tape machine. I didn't use any sounds that were in the computer. I've got a couple of synths behind me here. I've got like a Juno 60, which I love, and a Hydra synth, which I love, and they've both got patches in them that I've made. And then the Nord, which I've got this sort of not big library. And I've probably only got like 25 patches in there. But they're things that I know inside out. I know, if I want to do this kind of thing, it's 17 and I need to turn the attack up a bit or whatever it is. And so it enables you to strike this stuff down really quickly and get ideas down really quickly. And I'm sure you could, people obviously do that in software. I just feel like it requires a bit more dedication to being very disciplined and organized to have your stuff arranged in that way. But I had a great time just like putting the DAW into record, doing a pass, tweaking some sounds, doing another pass, little bit of editing, and it's like, great, job's done.
So
and
now
that's one of the things.
Are you not really using software synths anymore yourself, or do you still have a bunch that you?
I totally do. I'm very much trying to do the best of both. I'm trying to do the best of both worlds. I think a lot of the software synths sound incredible. They're definitely more kind of versatile in that you can have all this stuff running live and have 20 instances of your vintage whatever synth. I try and use both. And actually, I think if I was trying to compartmentalize it, I feel like if I'm producing sounds for other people and I want to be really kind of precise and articulate about being able to create a very particular thing, I'll probably do it in software. But if I'm working on my own projects and I'm more about trying to create like an overall, like the overall vibe of the whole thing, I'll probably do it on hardware.
I haven't
quite thought about that, but
I like what hardware controllers, whether it's hardware or whether it's just even a MIDI controller that's talking to something. I just like having the extra knobs and stuff because, when I think about you making drone or ambient music too, we're talking about long stretches of tones and notes that probably are making these sort of like wave-like changes as they're evolving. And so you kind of have to, I would think, have stuff that lets you make those adjustments. So for example, one of the keyboards I got was, I'm always afraid I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I got the Behringer DeepMind 12.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that if I pull up a patch on there, I immediately grab knobs and start changing it. And then it's like, and then I'm performing something. So I could see how in your world, the performer in you wants to have that. Whereas like, maybe a DJ who's making EDM beats, the precision of staying in the computer might be really appealing.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's quite genre-based, that decision as well. And like you say, for the more droney stuff and a lot of the film work that I do, a lot of the composition, if you like, is how you're turning the knobs when you're playing the notes, that is like 50% of the sound.
Yeah.
And again, you can totally do that in software. it just requires a different discipline to be able to like set it up and have it all mapped in the first place.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of really fortunate in the fact that I've been doing this for, 25 years now. And so I've collected some bits of gear along the way. So I've got a few choices and it's like, oh, okay, I can use that for this and that one for this. And it's great. And I do think for me, it allows me to do that kind of work much quicker than if I was doing it in software.
So question about all those synths you've got. To patch bay or not to patch bay?
Oh,
that is the question.
I mean, you could have asked that like an hour ago and we'd have still been talking about it now. For me, to not patch bay. I used to have I had a patch bay up until about 8 years ago, I reckon. I got rid of the patch bays that I had, and my studio is very much set up in a classic, like, desk patch bay recorder kind of way. I think what actually happened, the tipping point, was that I had about 3 patch points that failed on me in quite a short period of time at really frustrating points in a production. And it was just one of those things where you're like, right, that's it. The patch bay's out of here. Never doing it again. And as someone that's worked in studio maintenance, I can't, it's like, well, that was my own fault. I just needed to clean it more often,
Right.
But I didn't. And therefore it bit me in the backside. So how I've got it set up now and how I've had my stuff set up for, 7 or 8 years now is I've got an interface that's got 32 analog ins on it, and everything in my studio has an input. And so for quite a long time, I would have a template in Logic, which is what I tend to use most, which has all of my instruments with all of their inputs, and you put the ones in record that you want to record and you're good to go. But even with like 32 inputs, navigating your way around that template became a bit of a non-intuitive thing to do. So how I've got it set up now is slightly kind of counterintuitive, because what I do is I have everything on its individual input, but then I have like a abstraction layer in Logic that routes all of those inputs to one recording input, and
cool.
I control that with a MIDI controller.
What do songwriters, music producers, DJs, EDM artists, TV and film composers all have in common with you and me? We all need amazing sounds that instantly elevate our music to the desired style. That's why Native Instruments is your ultimate toolkit, offering a massive library of sounds for your studio. Whether you're into hip-hop, indie pop, classic rock, meditation music, dance beats, or orchestral arrangements, the Native Instruments Complete Bundle has it all. From drums, loops, and beats to synths, realistic strings, vintage bass, guitars, and keys, it's a comprehensive collection. I love recording real bands in my studio, but then enhancing the tracks with drum samples, synths, and futuristic keys from Battery, Contact, Massive X, Guitar Rig, and Hybrid keys, for example. It's a surefire way to make your productions sound modern and unique. Use the code ROCK10 to get 10% off, or get Complete Start for free today, featuring 2,000 sounds and 6 gigs of samples at nativeinstruments.com. I was just thinking about that the other day. I was just thinking about the loss of the traditional analog console, and I was wondering, I wonder if anybody's making just, I mean, I know they exist for things like Universal Audio and stuff, but just the intermediary software mixer, so that you could have lots of inputs, but still just kind of record to mono or stereo in your DAW.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. So I've got a bunch of different MIDI controllers, but basically what they do is I have a volume fader for each synth and 2 aux sends, and those aux sends route it in my software to physical outputs that go to some guitar pedals, and then those guitar pedal inputs also come up. So my like record tracks are always a synth, a delay pedal, and a reverb. So whatever I'm recording, I'm putting those 3 tracks into record, and I get my balance of whatever volume I've got on the fader plus my 2 sends, and then I've also got like a knob on each channel for high pass and low pass, so I can do a bit of shaping on the way in, which I also find to be like super useful for me. But yeah, I've been doing that for quite a long time now, and it works great for me at the moment. I really like it. I think it's a really good.
How many tracks are getting recorded when you're doing one overdub?
3.
Okay, so it's like the synth, the delay, the reverb.
The delay, the reverb. Yeah, exactly. So I just have like those 3 tracks in a kind of folder track. And then if I want to do another recording, I just duplicate the folder track and put it in record. And then I always know that whatever faders I've got pushed up on my MIDI controller get routed into that folder track.
Fascinating. So the MIDI controller is controlling that digital mixer that's hitting Logic.
Exactly.
And so the synth might be actually going into the digital world in the computer and then coming back out again to hit the analog pedals for the delays and the reverbs, which then get captured again.
Exactly.
Right. So the synth, it's not like the synth is getting recorded in and out of the computer. It's getting recorded once, but then the sends are going back out to the pedals.
Exactly.
Oh, that's very clever. That's a cool way to do it.
I really like it. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about having some guitar pedals set up is that you're printing effects to audio, which is something that, again, you can do it in software, but I think you just don't, because it's a bit of a ball ache to do it. So I've never seen anyone like regularly set that up, but I love like putting a synth track down and having the delay printed as an audio track, because then you can immediately process that delay differently, or just really simple stuff like just panning the delay to the left or whatever it is. Yeah. If you've got that as a printed audio track, my brain at least goes, oh, I can do something with that. If it's sort of hidden off in a software send somewhere and is running live, I'm way less inclined to want to mess with it because it's over there somewhere and it doesn't exist as audio yet.
I agree 100%. I find when we're doing, in my world, it might be more inclined to be a guitar overdub, and we might not be doing the fancy routing, but inevitably when the guitar player plays and I start performing the pedals, we get into the interesting stuff that everybody loves.
Yeah.
And that just doesn't happen for me as often when all the effects are digital plugins. I love the fact that we have the digital plugins because we get to create and sculpt and do all these amazing things. But you're right. Like, I'm much more inclined to make a physical change to a knob on the delay and, control the runaway delay. And I'd rather just print it that way and then pick the one that we like than try and have to write automation and, set it up like, okay, what 5 things do I have to set up for this automation move I want to try now?
Yeah.
And recently I also did a thing where I have and I wanted to ask you about this. I don't know, did you get into the Eventide H3000 or 9000 boxes? Is that part of your world at all?
It hasn't been for a long time. I used to work at this amazing studio up in Scotland that I spent a lot of time in that had an H8000.
Okay,
and I spent a lot of time with that, just, sending stuff to it and printing the returns.
Yeah.
And thought it was amazing. But I've never owned one, so I've never like learnt it to the extent that I know it backwards.
It's
but
a deep box, isn't it?
Yeah. I really love that world. And that's actually part of the reason I like the first guitar pedal I got was the Eventide Space pedal, which is their reverb.
Oh, cool.
And some of the reverbs in that actually reminded me a lot of some of the big reverbs that I used to print out of an H8000. So that was part of the reason that I went with the space pedal. So yeah, I love all that stuff. It's great.
Yeah. So I got such a simple thing recently that I'm very excited about. I just realized that I had the tap tempo and expression inputs on the H9000. And so I just got a pedal that just can sit over at the desk while I'm
Fantastic.
working, and an extension cord to run all the way back to the, to the rack unit.
Yeah.
But because I had done all these mixes at my Bonnaroo hay bale studio. So for 15 years, I ran the backstage studio at the Bonnaroo Festival here in Nashville.
Oh, wow. Fantastic.
Yeah. And it was fun. And it was recording live performances of bands in our studio through a console mixed down in real time. And one of the things that I did to be able to do that was to have a tap tempo for outboard delays. And I started doing things like just tapping whatever the hell I wanted during the performance of the song. Sometimes I'd go really short, sometimes I'd go long, sometimes it'd change. It became a performance. And it's like your description of the pedals. It occurred to me, it's like, wow, this opportunity to perform is lost in the computer world, where we sometimes just won't make a change. We'll set it and forget it.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
So it's just cool to hear you talk more about that. Yeah. Talk more about the places where you find an opportunity to perform when you're making records and not just set it and forget it.
Well, in the context of actually like performing live shows myself, or
no,
like...
we're in the studio.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I broadly have this rule, well, not really a rule, but like what I try and do is that if I'm going into the computer, everything is like, I'm committing everything to tape, if you like, and I'm tweaking stuff on the way in. Once it's in the computer, it rarely comes out of the computer again. I'm not really into the analog summing, or I'll very rarely like send something out of my computer into a pedal. Because for me, once it's in the computer, getting it out of the computer again just kind of breaks my workflow. Mm-hmm. And I feel like once I'm in the box, I'm just going to stay in the box. But whatever I can do to get interesting stuff in the box in the first place, that's kind of like 90% of the battle. So like with my synths, I've got basically like my room is set up that I've got my my monitors and my screen in the middle, and then I've basically got like a kind of synth set up on the right of me and a synth set up on the left of me. And the synths on the left are all the kind of paddy drone machine synths, and the synths on the right are more like the drum machine, beatbox, bassline, Euro rack, techno kind of things. Mm-hmm. And they both got this sort of same kind of setup of having the MIDI controller, so I can route all those to sort of one set of recording tracks. So what I'll usually do if I'm like creating stuff is I'll either start with something droney on the left hand side, or I'll start with something kind of beaty on the right hand side.
You don't do two hands at once like Viv Savage and Spinal Tap?
I can't reach that far. They're too far apart. And sometimes I'll combine that with something running in a soft synth at the same time. So the sync is set up so that like my Logic computer is always the master clock for anything. Even if I'm doing like an external beatbox kind of thing, it will be syncing to my computer. And the reason for that is that I want to know that whenever I do actually go into record, it's actually recording what I want it to record at the time that at the time that I want it to. Mm-hmm. So I'll usually start sort of building up some layers like that. I might have a combination of things that I'm playing in like real time with my actual hands, and then also some things that are playing from sequences. I love different sequences and all the different things that they bring to the game. So I've got this thing called a circle-on sequencer, which is like a rack mount MIDI sequencer that is it's kind of like a 303 909 kind of sequencing experience. Mm-hmm. And then there's the Swedish company Electron make this really great range of boxes that have got amazing sequences in them, but they're very much like their own design. And you have to kind of work the way that they want you to work, but it also just makes you create different stuff because you're doing it in a different way. Yeah. So I love trying to sort of embrace all the different workflows that these different bits of gear kind of lead you into, and then see where that leads to, because everything is all synced up, I can use like 3 different sequences at the same time, but have them all run in sync with each other.
So just to reiterate that, even though we can do whatever we want sequencing out of a Logic session or a Pro Tools session, or Ableton Live or whatever, there's still something creatively fun and inspiring about having one of these sequencer boxes where you just see the 16 lights going back and forth. And
I think so, yeah, and that's definitely where I'm at. And it might be simply nostalgia. I was born in the late 70s. I grew up in the 80s when like synthesizers were really being a thing, and I remember like the first sort of electronic music studio I went to, which was a friend of my dad's, and they had in this studio like one of the first sampling machines that was. It wasn't a Fairlight. It was something else, but it was one of the earlier, slightly more readily available sampling machines, and it just blew me away, And then like I went to a studio a bit after that, and I saw like a 909. I was like, oh wow, okay. So all these things that I do now might just be the nostalgia of me. I grew up in that time when these things were new and exciting, but at the same time,
I
think it's important.
In the right mood,
It does totally, but at the same time, I'm also really wary of the fact that I think if you're like 20 now and that isn't part of your nostalgia, I don't think it's necessarily a good thing that you suddenly go out and buy all these hardware sequencers because they're going to give you a better result. I'm not convinced that's true. They're going to give you a different result, and you might have a lot of fun doing it. But I don't think there's anything inherently better about doing it that way. I just think for me, it resonates and makes me create different things. But, I think a lot, like I say, I think a lot of that is just my age.
Yeah, well, it's cool. Well, I appreciate you saying that maybe I look 20 on the video here, but I'm 56, so I get to go and get one. I'm excited. I want to go get a 303 and the sequencer and all that.
It's great fun. I still really love the tactile nature of doing this stuff. The other part of it is for me is that once I'm actually mixing, that's all in the box for me. So that's all the computer. So I kind of want to try and create situations where before the mix, when I'm actually like generating the stuff to be mixed, I kind of want it to not be computery, just because it then sort of divides up the project,
I agree. I mean, that's one of the things I love about recording with a full band, because the rest of the time it's going to be me against the computer screen.
Yeah, totally. And it is those. It's when you're in the you've got those other people there as well. I feel like it's really difficult to have a multi-person interaction with a computer. Computers are very much like a one-to-one device.
How often do you get to assign everybody to some synth box controller, drum machine, keyboard, and now you're all playing it together and sort of performing it down in the recording?
I don't do that a great deal in my own studio, but I was just, at the end of last year, I was working on this project in New York with Arca, who was doing a show at the Armory there. And she creates these amazing, like improvisation playgrounds, where she's got this incredible stage set up with these different instrumental zones all over it that she can just walk around and improvise. And we had some really good fun there setting up these situations where you could, it's like, okay, I'm going to play this here and I'm going to set up a loop on this here, but then I'm going to walk over here and play this thing over here, but it's still got to be kind of broadly in time with this loop I created here. And that's that similar thing. It's like when you've got other people there and you're trying to work out, what are we actually trying to achieve here? What do we need to do to make this exciting and improvisable and performable? That's the stuff that I find really fascinating. And then, oftentimes when I've done that, then I'll come back into my own studio and it's like, oh, if I put this over here and have it plugged in that way, it's going to inspire me to do this kind of thing,
Yeah.
So the setup's always changing. I'm always moving stuff around and trying to find different ways to do it. And just, try and keep it exciting.
So another record from your discography, Snow from Yesterday with Manu Delago.
Yeah.
Mad About Lemon. Paintings on the Wall, I think is the song.
Yeah.
Great sound. It sounds like wind instruments. It sounds like pan drums, metal pan drums. And then the vocals sound like there's a vocoder kind of aspect to them too. What's the story with that one? And does that have have anything to do with what you're describing about these sort of rhythmic zones of your synths versus the ambient stuff?
I'm really glad you asked about that, because I think I'm really proud of that record. I mixed that record. I've worked with Manu Largo for quite a lot of years now, and some of his records I've co-produced with him. But with this one, we did it all entirely remotely, and he produced it and basically sent me over the projects to mix. So I didn't actually work on that from a production point of view. But I do think it's a beautiful record. I'm really proud of how it turned out. So Manu Largo, thanks so much. Manu Largo is a percussionist and hang drum player. He was, I don't know if you know the hang drum, but it's basically this kind of like inside out steel drum. Mm-hmm. It looks a bit like a UFO.
Sort of rounded on the top, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they're I want to say they're pentatonic, but that might not be true. But anyway, you can't play a chromatic scale on one of them. So in order to play chromatically, you need 3 of them in different keys, and then you have to like move between them to play a chromatic scale. And when Manu started playing the hang, many years ago, I don't know exactly how many, but I believe that he was one of like literally the first people to go, oh, okay, well, if I actually want to play with other musicians and play in different keys, I need to learn how to play 3 of these.
Wow.
And when you watch him play it, it's a real, it really makes your head hurt, because it's deeply unintuitive to actually get, like a C major chord to a D major chord is like this really complicated maneuver, wow. But he spent years perfecting how to do this, and now is like completely fluent in being able to play across the 3 of them and play them chromatically.
So when you're mixing this stuff, maybe talk a little bit about your mix setup and how you approach a record like that. And, do you start your mixes from sort of in the same way that you've got, you're very organized about the stage? Do you have sort of templates that allow you to begin your mixing process, and do you have things routed and arranged how you like?
I never use a template for anything, apart from if I'm doing, the only exception to that is if I'm doing like an orchestral MIDI mock-up, where you've got like 700 instruments for all of your orchestra, and it would just be crazy to start from scratch each time. But that's the only template that I ever use. I never use a template for like composing stuff, and I never use a template for mixing stuff. I kind of tried it years ago, and I just found that it made it less fun for me. I in a sense, I want to reinvent the wheel every time, because I feel like every song is different. And even if it's guitar, bass, drums, vocals, like every song is different. It has a different story. It's going to require different things. So I don't want like my guitar bus, I want to listen to what's on the thing, listen to what's on the multitrack, and go, okay, what are we trying to do with this? What does this require? Maybe it requires nothing, And Manu's stuff is very kind of eclectic. The arrangements are very different from song to song. So in a sense, it kind of wouldn't make sense to have a template for that anyway. So with a song like that, I think my kind of methodology was that it's primarily, that particular song is the brass arrangement and the vocals. And he recorded this record with a vocal trio called Mad About Lemon, that are 3 female singers. And so pretty much every lead vocal is 3 vocals. And that took me a little while to get my head around, because I really like the, single right up the front vocal right between the speakers that really sets your kind of sense of depth perception that this is at the front. And with this one, there were 3 vocals for everything. And so you kind of can't approach it like that. So you're immediately creating a sort of different space to set everyone in.
So that's sort of what gives it that vocoder.
I think so.
It's just the
exactly
tight harmonies, the unified harmonies.
Yeah, and when they do, they quite often will sing like a harmony, but then one of the harmonies drifts into the same note that one of the others is singing. So you get these really cool like overtones created.
That's cool.
So I think I'd mixed like a couple of songs off that record and hadn't got the approach right. And I was trying things where almost in kind of like a sort of Beatles way, I'd have like one vocal full left and one in the middle and one full right. But then it just made it difficult to then create like depth behind that full left right thing. So I'd done sort of 2 or 3 songs and hadn't really got it right. And Manu kept on saying, no, I think we should just like treat the 3 vocals as one vocal. It's got to sound like a single sound. So then I started like panning everything in a bit more, a bit less reverb on and a bit less affected stuff on it, and just kind of treating it almost a bit more like 3 singers standing around a single microphone. Mm-hmm. Although it was actually 3 mics, but trying to go for that kind of sound and then creating the space around it. And one of the things that I always try and do, even with electronic music where there aren't actual like music, people involved in the sort of instrumental performance, I like to try and imagine a sort of sound plane where I can see where everyone is. So, if I've got these 3 singers that are in the kind of frontish and in the middle, and then there's a brass group that are kind of around them, and the hang drum might be kind of just behind the singers to the left, and the percussion might be just behind the singers to the right, and just trying to imagine what that actually looks like if all those people were on a stage, and then try and create that space and depth to replicate what it might look like on stage. And I do the same thing with electronic music as well. It's like, okay, well, the bass synth might occupy this space here, but then the lead synth might be like standing up on a riser on the back of the stage there, and just try and create this sort of space around stuff. Yeah. And so, I was really pleased with how that record turned out. I think it's got some really beautiful songs on it and really beautiful arrangements.
Do you feel like all the time that you've spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all of your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Listen to this quote from one of our students, David. Quote, absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mixing process I've ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, condensed into a 6 to 7 hour session, close quote. Look, I'm so confident that the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass will take your mixes to the next level, that if you can't get a killer mix within 30 days, I'll give you a full refund, no questions asked. So if you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then go to ultimatemixingmasterclass.com and start now by checking out the free preview of the Ultimate Snare Mixing Trick, and I'll save a seat for you at the front row table at the Grammys. Very cool. Well, so another one of your records, Extemporate. I think that's yours, right? Correct?
Yeah, that's the record I put out most recently. So I put that out end of last year.
One of the tracks is called Part 9, and it's got this great sound it sounds like samples of kids' voices or something like that. And then there's this quality that almost makes it sound like you recorded it with a contact mic, and it's this cool, weird radiophonic distortion kind of stuff. Tell us about that track and about that record and some of the things you had fun exploring in the sound creation.
It's so fascinating hearing other people talk about stuff that you've made, because it just immediately puts stuff in a really different context. Yeah. It's amazing. So that particular track, the sounds on it are my daughter, who is 7, and when she was probably 6, she was taking a bath one night and she was putting something under the water. This is a bit of a long tangent, but stay with me. Right. She was putting something under the water and she was like, Dad, I want to know what it sounds like under the water. And I was like, well, if you put your ear under the water, you'll be able to hear some of it. And she knows that I like recording stuff. And so she said, oh, Dad, you'd really like it. You should record it. I was like, I don't really have anything I can record underwater with. And she said, well, can't you just get a microphone? And I was like, yeah, you can. So so I ordered a hydrophone and plugged it into a little field recorder and we recorded stuff in the bathtub, and then we recorded stuff in the pond. And so we had this period of time where we were just wandering around recording stuff. And so I've got a bunch of these recordings where, and this wasn't with the hydrophone now, this was just with a, handheld field recorder, like walking through one of the forests here and Sia making like animal noises to see how they reflect off the trees, and then listening to the recordings of them. So I got a stack of these recordings and I started like layering them up. And I didn't do it with the intention of like using them as sort of part of my sound design. But as I started layering them up and pitching them around, the echoes of the sound in the forest through the field recorder just had this, for me, this really like visceral, immediate sense of place to them. So I listened to it and I was like, oh, I'm in that forest. And I don't know if other people listening to that would feel the same thing because they weren't in that forest. But I whenever I sort of hear a sound and it immediately puts me into a place, I try and use it for something, because that's always what I'm striving for. I want somebody to be able to listen to a sound and it immediately conjure some place or feeling or emotion or sensation. And it doesn't really matter what specifically that is. I just want it to be something,
Right.
So with a lot of those field recordings, they had, for me, this real immediate sense of space and place around them. And so I used quite a lot of them across this last record that I did as either like textures that run all the way through, or on that track Part 9, it actually starts off with, and you can like you say, you can hear that it's like kids' voices in the forest. Then I do, I'd like take little elements of it and sort of chop it into eighth notes and just have that as a little pulsing loop running all the way through stuff. So yeah, that's where that came from.
That's very cool. What is a useful field recorder to you? Is it something? I mean, do you have like an old Nagra tape machine that you carry around?
I'd love to. I love those things. But no, I have a little Tascam. Is it the something 6? There's a 6 and an 8.
One of the newer ones, yeah. So
yeah,
I had I think I have the DR40 was one of the first ones I got.
Yeah, right.
Now I have this Sound Devices Mix Pre, which I really love a lot. And we're recording on it right now. In fact, I use it for the podcast interviews.
Cool. I would love something like a Nagra, because I love the like the mechanics and the beauty of the design. But actually, I love the fact with this that I can give it to my 7-year-old and she knows where record is, and it's like, great, do your thing. So yeah, I'm a big fan of the little Tascams.
Have you found that some of the iPhone apps for doing field recordings can be really useful too?
I haven't used the iPhone for field recordings. I use it a lot for recording my piano. There's, and I think a lot of people have talked about this, but there's something really unique about the like compression and stuff that the voice memo recorder does. And I'll quite often just do something like, if I want to record my upright piano, which isn't in my studio, it's in my living room, which doesn't have any like recording set up around it. But I'll just, have something like the metronome, like a visual metronome on my phone, so I know what tempo the track is, and I'll just play the part and record it onto the cell phone microphone that might be sitting like 10 feet away on the table, and then fly that audio file back into my mix session.
Cool.
And actually, Damien introduced me to this other thing, which is that if you've got 2 people with iPhones, you can do it in stereo. And you just like hold them at 2 different ends of the room, and it sounds fantastic. It's got this real like sort of Beatles piano quality to it. I really love it. And I've used iPhone recordings a lot for little fly-in things like that. I haven't used it for field recording. No particular reason, probably because I've got a field recorder.
Well, that's a form of field recording. Your living room's a field if it's not in the studio.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
There's some fun. I mean, there's some really fun apps. One of the ones I mentioned on the show here is Koala. Is a little sampler app that just seems to have a really cool, unique sound. And then I was introduced to, I think it's XLN Life.
I've been looking at that. That looks really fascinating.
It's fascinating, yeah. I mean, what it does is you record into it, and then it sort of chops it up, and it talks to the plugin back in your studio so that it opens right up in your session, and it also like whips up some beats for you and some sounds. It may be one of those instances where, especially for you, you might be like, stop doing so much stuff for me. Let me do something, but it's fun, man. I mean, like you, I think, I've been doing this for a while, and I think even in the beginning, we were fascinated by the tech, and we're still fascinated by the tech, but you carry with you this knowledge of stuff that you've used in the past. You were talking about doing the field recordings and having this sense of space from these different places. Do you have any stories you want to share about some of the craziest acoustical reverbs or ambiences physically in the world that you've ever recorded in or have heard that just blew your mind?
Oh man, that's an interesting one. The one that comes to mind, which I wasn't recording, but it's the one, and again, this is kind of a nostalgic thing, I think. When I was younger, in the UK, there's this road tunnel that goes underneath the River Thames. And I don't know if you can sort of picture this, but it's like bored out as a circular tunnel. And then like halfway up the tunnel is the road. Mm-hmm. So the road is like halfway up the tunnel. So the kind of bottom part of the semicircle is basically like a service tunnel that doesn't really get used for much. And I remember when I was a kid, I went to, I can't even remember why now, but I don't know how I ended up there, but I went to this thing and I was getting shown around. I think it's like some kids group or something. And they were showing us around this, I think it was like a relatively new construction at the time, and how it was built and all this stuff. And we went into this underground tunnel. So we're like in the bottom half of the tunnel with the road above us, but it's underneath a river. And the tunnel is, probably like a mile long.
Yeah.
And I just remember like you spoke in there and the reverb seemed to go on forever, but it was probably like, I don't know, a 30-second reverb or something like that.
That's amazing.
It was totally wild. Things like that, particularly when you're young, create a really strong impression. And I find myself always trying to like get back to those, like that sense of space and place that creates things like that.
You probably do the same thing with your daughter that I did with mine when we'd go on bike rides. Every time we'd go through some kind of tunnel, I'd show her how we'd just start yelling echo from our bikes,
wherever
totally. We were in Nashville, we'd be yelling echo in every tunnel and hear all the spaces. There was a art installation up in Calgary, or something like that. And back in 2005, when I was finishing mixes, that's when I'd learned about it. And I was finishing mixes on a record for Roscoe Gordon, a blues artist here. And he had a song called Cheese and Crackers. And when he hits the bridge, he goes, cheese, and he holds the note really long. Then, crackers, anyone. And it was his shtick in that song.
Yeah.
But the art installation was called Xylophone. And they had taken over these huge grain silos somewhere up in Canada again. And they turned it into an art installation where they'd have speakers and microphones in them. And it was at least a 20-second reverb. And they had it hooked up to computers that were a website. So you could go and you could upload your WAV file, and then, it would take a while, and eventually it would feed it out through this thing, and then they'd put it back in the download folder, and so you could go download it. And so I ended up using it on the bridge and then just sort of like sliding it into the mix and really having a lot of fun doing that stuff.
Yeah, that's great.
And I always like the idea that, somewhere up in the frozen tundra up in northern, the Great White North up there, some moose was like going like, what the hell is that? And hearing this cheese
That's
and
brilliant.
crackers
I love
echoing.
That. Yeah, I think that the one of the most interesting acoustics that I've experienced is almost the exact opposite of that, which is so another project I did with Manu Delago a few years ago. He did a project called Parasol Peak, which was probably worth a podcast in itself. But basically, he wrote a record in order to be performed while climbing up a mountain. And so all of the musicians needed to take their instruments with, and this is like proper like mountain climbing. And he had like a cellist and a trombone and a bass clarinet and the hang drums and a trumpet and a camera crew and audio recordists. And they all climbed this mountain, and at each like stopping point up the mountain, they performed one of these songs. And it was all filmed and recorded. And I think they recorded it on like 3 or 4 little Tascam recorders, and then like synced them all up afterwards. But one of the really fascinating things about it for me was that there was no reverb, you know. And when I was looking at it on the screen and trying to match, you know, the spaces together, my sort of instinct was, oh, it's this huge, wide open space. It's, you know, we need to add, but it just looked stupid. It just didn't work at all. And so I ended up, I think there's like literally no reverb whatsoever on that record, because there's nothing for it to reflect off,
right,
apart from the snow on the ground, and that's not particularly reflective. And I thought it was really interesting that in my mind I had this totally different perception of what that would actually sound like, you know?
Yeah.
And the only time that we added reverb to it was that there was one song on that record where he actually had 2 of the musicians climb up like a different peak. And so they're actually like on different mountaintops, and like way in the distance, there's, I think, like a trombonist and a trumpet player that are playing this part. And that needed some reverb on it because it was a long way away.
That's cool.
It's an amazing project. I think you can the video for it is online. It's called Parasol Peak, and it's a pretty amazing project.
Awesome. This podcast is proud to present Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you're ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I master my own records using nothing but plugins. Plus, I take you into a world-class mastering studio, Sterling Sound, to meet with Ryan Smith and hear how he professionally mastered my record, Skadoosh, for release to streaming platforms. That's the music you hear on this podcast, Rockstars. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free mixing course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins and Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads for you to practice mixing and even upload to your website if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/academy to get started now. Well, let me ask you a couple of quick closing out questions. We can go through these really quick. Do you want to share a favorite hardware tool or something that's fun, or just anything that you're excited about now that's fun to make records with in the studio?
This is kind of boring, but it's actually a bit of a game changer for me. I use RME audio interfaces, and they have a bit of software called Total Mix, which is their kind of it's their mixer layer that sits outside of your door. And there's also a remote for the software that is basically your monitor controller. So it's literally like a MIDI volume knob with 12 assignable buttons that you can assign to do things that you want to do. And
that's how you get your blends in when you're recording.
No, that's I use a Novation fader controller for that, launch control. This is literally like the monitor controller.
Okay, great.
So it's like speaker volume, but it's got assignable buttons that you can do things like, I'm listening to 5.1. Now I'm listening to the stereo down mix of my 5.1. Now I want to listen to a mono mix, but only in one speaker. Now I want to listen to the left-right, but I want to flip them round to see if the balance is like screwy one way or the other. Basically, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I've never seen on monitor controllers that are things that I want in a monitor controller. And because you can program it to do whatever you want to do, it's like, oh, this is the perfect monitor controller. And it's like a, probably like $180 box, because it's basically a MIDI controller. But the fact that you can program it to do whatever you want it to do with the RME software, this is kind of sacrilege. Like, I used to have a really fancy analog Grace monitor volume control, and I'd had it for years, and it's a beautiful, beautiful box. But functionally, it just didn't do the useful things that I wanted it to do. And I've replaced it with this super cheap MIDI controller, and it's made my studio days much more enjoyable.
It's just a good reminder that there's a lot of beautifully built, really top-notch gear out there that might be the right thing for us, but we should remember that sometimes just trusting our own creative intention, like I just want to do this to make something, and
I think
it's simple ways.
I think it's like increasingly difficult in the sort of YouTube age where every studio you see has got this, like, they're all crammed with incredible gear. It's like, oh, I got this new, and I say that knowing full well that I'm surrounded by synthesizers. But everyone is very specific. Everyone has very specific needs and things that is going to make their workflow work for them. And sometimes it takes quite a long time to figure out what that actually is. And sometimes you can only do it by like trial and error and buying a few things that aren't quite right from you.
So give us a favorite software tool or anything you're just excited. Anything you want to give a shout out to? New synth, new plugin, new whatever.
I really love the Softube synths. I'm like I was saying earlier, I'm a bit of like a hardware diehard for synths, but Softube makes some incredible sounding software synths. They're just like, for me, they're just sort of they do sound, I think, identical to the hardware, but that's not why I like them, because I kind of think you get to a point where it doesn't really matter if it sounds like a mini Moog or not. Like, does it make a good sound that's useful to you? That's the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
These happen to sound like the originals, but they're also super inspiring to use and just, I think, immediately sound good and make you want to create stuff with them.
Awesome.
So yeah, I use those all the time.
Anything you want to share as an organizational tip for the studio?
I'm very reliant on Dropbox for all sorts of file sharing things. But I also realize that I still don't entirely understand how Dropbox works. And by that, I mean, I just ran into this thing this morning where somebody else had shared this massive folder with me that I wasn't actually syncing to my computer, but because I was shared on it, it was taking up my Dropbox account space. And therefore, I couldn't sync anything else because it was full up of this stuff that I wasn't even syncing to my computer, And I didn't even fully understand that that's how Dropbox worked, but now I know. So yeah, I think like having a really good understanding of how things like Dropbox work and how cloud backup things actually work, and like, do you actually want it to back up, or do you want it to copy? Like, do you want it to duplicate everything that's on your hard drive, or do you want it to keep what your hard drive looked like yesterday? And having a really good understanding of what all of those differences are, I think, is super important to making a studio work in the 2020s.
Yeah, it took me ages to finally adopt the built-in time machine backup feature of Mac OS. And then when I did, I was just like, holy crap, this is incredible. It's a pretty simple thing to just get a ginormous old spinning hard drive, and put it in a case or something off to the side and let it just do its thing. And it's amazing that I could go back 6 months of whatever was going on in my studio and go, pull up that Finder window, and there's all the sessions I was working on,
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
It's a cool thing. All right. So this is a closing question. This is hypothetical. I like to ask this of all our guests, and we get to take the Wayback Studio machine. Don't go too far back because we started early. We don't need to go all the way back to wire recorders or anything like that. Now you get to go back in time and you find young Matt and you say, listen, dude, here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice do you think you might like to go back and give yourself if you could?
I think it would probably be along the lines of being confident enough to find your own voice in whatever you're doing. I think I not wasted, but didn't progress as much as I could have done for quite a long time because I was really hung up on oh, but it doesn't sound as good as this, or it doesn't sound like this. And I had this thing about like, it's got to sound like a record. And I don't even know what that really means now, because the glory of it is that a record can sound like anything.
Yeah.
But I think I sort of held myself back in a way by being overly concerned with fitting into other people's versions of what something should sound like. And then as I've got a bit older, I'm like, no, actually, I'm just creating this thing, and all the intentions. Like the important thing behind it is the intention. It's like you're telling us, you're either like helping tell a story for an artist, or you're helping sculpt a score around a film. But it's always about that story, and it might be somebody else's story, or it might be your own story. But having the confidence to know that actually what you're creating, because those intentions are good, is kind of by definition is sounding like a record.
Do you still have an inner critic?
Oh goodness, yes. But I'm realizing it's critiquing different things now. Yeah, I never stop the critical side, but yeah, I think I'm concerned about different things than I was like 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about telling a story, I think sometimes our inner critic tells us we don't have a story to tell.
Yeah.
But I think when you allow yourself to just go there, you realize you've got plenty of story to tell.
Totally. Everybody has.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Next time I'm up in Canada,
you.
maybe I come see that that Hammond organ in person or something.
I'd love it. Yeah, I'd love to.
I love the story of recording with the hydrophone. That's amazing. What a cool thing to do. I half thought you were going to say we just took a SM7 and put a plastic bag around it and dropped it in the tub,
Maybe that's what I should have done. I'll try that as well.
I mean, I guess as a parent too, you're like, this thing's not going to electrocute my kid, is it?
Yeah, I'll try it next time.
Let the rock stars know, where can they go find you online, learn more about you, hear more of your music if you want. I know you've got films coming out or already out that we may want to check out. And what if they just simply want to add that incredible element to their record and they need to seek you out?
So I don't do social media, which is, probably
smart.
Smart or stupid, depending on which day it is. So my website is very simple. It's mattrobertsonmusic.com. And people can contact me through that. The easiest way to find my music is on Spotify or Apple Music, and just Google Matt Robertson. If people do that, they will notice that there is more than one Matt Robertson. But if you've listened to any of this podcast, you'll know which one it is.
All right, fair enough. He's not ambient.
Exactly.
Not ambient enough.
Yeah, there's a country music Matt Robertson and kind of like a trance DJ Matt Robertson. And then there's me.
I think searching Matt Robertson, I did see a little icon in the icon. There was a cowboy hat on. I was like, that's not him.
Yeah, that's not me.
And then Rockstars, a reminder, we've got links in the show notes too. So if you scroll down, you can go listen to some of these records right now and enjoy it. They're really beautiful sounding stuff. Really, so much more I could ask you about it. So maybe we'll have to have you back in the future, Matt.
I'd love that. It would be a pleasure.
All right, man. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening, Rockstars. Matt, you rock, and thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging with us. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our awesome sponsors who help make this episode possible. Grace Design, Atom Audio, Native Instruments, and Isotope. And remember, at isotope.com and nativeinstruments.com, use the coupon code ROCK10 for 10% off any plugin purchase. If you enjoyed Recording Studio Rockstars, please check out our sponsors using the links in our show notes because it's a great way to help support this show. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. I would also like to thank our fantastic team here at Recording Studio Rockstars, Vlad Weselchenko, Braden Stremming, and Liz Hulitskaya. Thanks so much for listening, Rockstars, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.